I need to give a quick content warning on this episode. We are going to get into some details that are very graphic in nature that may be triggering to sensitive audiences. Normally, this is a light and fun podcast, and I encourage you to listen in your car on the way to practice. But what has happened in the cheer industry in the last several weeks is not light and fun. So get in a place where you can put the earbuds in or be on your own and know that there is some triggering and explicit content in this episode. Okay. I did not want to talk about this. I didn't feel like I had any authority to talk about this. This is a very new podcast, and I don't even know if I have if I've built up enough trust to be able to talk about this. Trust from my listeners, that is. And I really battled with it. And even once I decided that it needed to be talked about, I battled even harder. So please bear with me. This affects so many people, and it's ongoing, and it's incredibly sensitive, and there are kids involved. And it's not my experience, and I have a hard time talking about other people's experiences. This affects the victims and their families, and first and foremost. And to them, I say that I pray that they can find the healing and the support and the love that they need. This affects the athletes of not just the Rockstar Gym in South Carolina, but Rockstar gyms all over the country have had to make big changes and have had to explain to their families. And those families have had to explain to their kids who probably had never even met Scott Foster. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, we're going to get into it. This affects Scott Foster's kids. They just lost their dad, and now they're having to learn of this information very publicly. So when we do get into this, please know that I am trying to be so careful with these victims' stories and with the information that we have that is, it seems to be updated almost daily. I'm recording this on Sunday, September 18th. This will come out on Tuesday, September 20th. Things may have already changed by then. I did my best to come up with, to research, not come up with, to research all of the information that I could, and I'm going to cite all of those sources on the website in the show notes. So you'll find a link to that in the description of the podcast or linked down below on YouTube. I have followed news sources. I pulled what I believe are the original documents that are unaltered within the lawsuits. Those were posted by USA Today. So I tried to pull from as reputable and resources as I could. Please know I'm not an expert. I'm not an attorney. I'm just a parent whose life has been consumed by this sport of all-star cheer for the last 10 years. And I not only did I spend hours and days watching and listening, even when I had all the information together, I had to stop and have a good cry and take a nap and then try to bring this to you. And this is actually the second time I have tried to record the episode. I'm going to try to tell this story accurately and factually and just give the information. I'm not a journalist either, although I felt like one. I have a huge appreciation for what journalists do. I'm going to try not to speculate. What I want to do is to educate, to create positive community somehow out of this. I really just want us to come together as cheer parents and feel like we're not alone. And hopefully lead us to a place where we feel like we have a little bit more control, because I think that's what the crux of all this emotion is of course feeling for the victims and knowing that that could have been anybody that happened to, and feeling like, what do we do? What do we do? I feel overwhelmed and helpless. I imagine you feel overwhelmed and helpless. And I just want us to know that we're in this together. So I'm gonna bring the story to you. I'm gonna bring it in the form of a timeline. If you don't know, again, if you don't know what's going on, you'll know after you listen to this episode what we know so far. And I want to say, if you are still listening, even though we're just a couple of minutes in, with the intent to hear this story from me, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for trusting me with this sensitive topic. All right. So I'm going to do this in chronological order. On August 22nd, Scott Foster, who was the founder, owner, coach of Rockstar Cheer. Rockstar Cheer was a very popular, very famous program in the all-star cheer world. My daughter was a huge fan of Rockstar Beatles for a number of years. I have seen them perform live. Rockstar Cheer was a big deal in the cheer industry. It was one of the top, I'd say, definitely in the top 5 gyms in the world. On August 22nd, Scott Foster, their founder, owner, and coach, was found dead in his car. It was later released that it was death intentionally. I do need to be careful of the words that I use because community guidelines will take this episode down if I don't. On August the 29th, just a week later, it was revealed that Foster was under investigation by multiple victims, including by the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. We will get into that. Also on August 29th, a lawsuit was filed on behalf of John Doe as the next friend of Jane Doe. And based on one little sentence that I'll read in the lawsuit, I believe that it's the victim's father that brought the lawsuit. And the attorneys filing the lawsuit are Chappelle, Smith, and Arden. And the lawsuit is against Scott Foster, Rockstar Cheer and Dance Incorporated, Varsity Spirit LLC, the United States All-Star Federation, or the USASF as we know it, the National Center for Safety Initiatives, LLC. And I'm not going to read the lawsuit in its entirety. You will be able to find it on the website if you just click the link in the show notes. It's about 14 pages long. The first several pages really just lays out who the plaintiff, who the claimant is, while still protecting their identity, who Rockstar Cheer is, who Varsity is, who the USASF is. But the lawsuit reads in part, Scott Foster, in his capacity as coach, was given custody and supervision of minors, including the plaintiff, Jane Doe. Foster used his position to coerce children to concede to his sexual suggestions, using his authority and position of trust to exploit them physically, sexually, and emotionally. Over the course of a year, beginning in early 2020, Foster began to take an interest in Plaintiff upon her promotion to the top-tier team within Rockstar. Over the next 6 months, Foster had multiple communications with Plaintiff, primarily through Snapchat, that included messages of a sexual nature, explicit pictures of himself, and requests for explicit pictures of the plaintiff. The plaintiff provided those pictures to Foster via Snapchat. Over the following year, on at least 10 occasions, plaintiff was persuaded into performing various acts, including, and I'm not going to read the next part, you can use your imagination. These acts occurred at Foster's home, in Foster's vehicle, Rockstar's facility, at hotels during competitions, and in both South Carolina and Florida. During multiple of these occasions, plaintiff was provided alcohol by Foster in an effort to further persuade plaintiff to perform these acts with him. Defendant Rockstar knew, or should have known, Foster's propensity to engage in the above described conduct. Defendant USASF and Varsity, upon information and belief, received complaints prior to and during the above described conduct of Defendant Foster and failed to act in a manner reasonable given the seriousness of the allegations. Rockstar represented to plaintiff that Foster had undergone a background check and had undergone training specific to the care of minors, and that these checks and training provided no indications that Foster had a propensity for sexual misconduct toward a minor. Upon information and belief, defendant Rockstar knew or should have known the unlawful misconduct of Foster as a coach and agent of Rockstar and failed to take reasonable steps to prevent future acts of unlawful sexual misconduct. This also says that the USASF and Varsity received complaints with regard to this conduct, including inappropriate behavior with the athletes under his care. And this is the part that makes me think it was her dad who made the lawsuit. Further, plaintiff John Doe, as the biological parent and next friend of minor Jane Doe, suffered damages as a direct and proximate result of the defendant's actions complained of herein. Can you imagine? I cannot. Being a parent and having to detail this. So that's just a brief summary of the first lawsuit, filed on August 29th. On or around that day, all 16 Rockstar Gym affiliates canceled their license agreement with Rockstar Cheer. So the way that it works, if you don't know, is that it's basically a franchise deal. So you have the main franchisor, which was Rockstar Cheer in South Carolina, and they had all of these franchisees that bought into the Rockstar brand and benefited from the resources, the coaching, the model that Rockstar provided, the branding of Rockstar. They ended that agreement as soon as that lawsuit was filed, and all of those gyms now have different names. On August 30th, Kathy, the wife of Scott Foster, released a statement. And that statement reads, "I am heartbroken by the recent allegations made by current and former athletes from Rockstar Cheer and other cheer gyms across our community. I hope the survivors are seeking and receive the support they need. I am sympathetic to their stories and will cooperate with all involved to make sure our athletes learn and grow in a safe environment. At this time, I am focusing on providing needed support to my children as they come to terms with the loss of their father." F also came out with a statement on or around August 30th saying the U.S. All-Star Federation, USASF, a membership organization for competitive cheer and dance, is devastated to learn of allegations about potential abuse of all-star athletes in South Carolina and potentially other areas as well. Our organization is dedicated to athlete safety in all aspects and has created a strong foundation that relies on athletes, coaches, event producers, and parents to report allegations of prohibited conduct affecting members at events and facilities where our members are present. We respect the central role of law enforcement in investigating such reports as part of our commitment to a safe environment for all members. Supporting USASF members is a priority. We will not comment on allegations or developments associated with this matter to allow law enforcement to appropriately investigate the allegations. We are continuing our efforts to promote safety for all of our members and help them understand that they should report any allegations to law enforcement as well as to USASF. If you know something, do not assume it has been reported. The assumption is often why things go unreported and therefore are not investigated. Keeping athletes safe takes everyone. Now more than ever, everyone needs to come together to create an environment where all members are safe, happy, and have room to grow and be successful. There is no place in All Star for anything but our best. To make a report, please follow these steps, and it leads to usasf.net/reporting. Just 2 days later, on September 1st, a second lawsuit was filed, and this one was filed by Strom Law Firm, LLC. It is filed on behalf of Jane Doe 1, Jane Doe 2, Jane Doe 3, Jane Doe 4, John Doe 1, John Doe 2, and John and Jane Does 1 through 100. It seems to me that this is a separate suit. And this is filed against Varsity Brands, LLC, Varsity Spirit, LLC, Varsity Brands Holding Company, Incorporated, U.S. All-Star Federation, Charles Bank Capital Partners, LP, Bain Capital, LP, Rockstar Cheer and Dance, Incorporated, Scott Foster, deceased, Kathy Foster, and other unknown defendants. And from what I can tell, this is a completely separate lawsuit from the first one. And if you caught that, it's over 100 claimants, over 100 victims. Also on this day, Varsity released a statement. It says, "Dear Varsity Spirit family, we at Varsity Spirit share in the sorrow with our all-star community during these difficult times. These allegations are devastating to hear, and our hearts are broken right alongside yours. We understand that these allegations are causing concerns and raising questions. Scott Foster is accused of abhorrent, criminal, predatory conduct. The alleged conduct runs counter to everything the cheer and dance community is intended to represent. All-Star is an accepting, caring community. We are devastated for anyone who has been impacted by the egregious conduct and violation of trust his alleged behavior represents. We love this sport. We love the programs, the teams, and the families who participate in it. Varsity Spirit events have and will continue to set the highest standards in athlete safety. Athlete protection will continue to be our top priority. Thank you, Bill Seeley, President, Varsity Spirit." Now, I'm not going to go through this lawsuit because shortly after it was amended, and that's the one that we're going to go through because it was updated with a lot more information and a lot more detail. So that was September 1st. September 6th, Rockstar leadership sent an email to its members announcing that the gym will close indefinitely. Now, I pulled this one from social media. I saw it in several places, so I don't have any reason to believe that this was fabricated at all. It says, "To our cheer family, we want to acknowledge the pain everyone is feeling during this incredibly difficult time. The information we are all receiving is dispiriting. We stand with you as you process this in whatever way you need. Many of you have asked what will happen next to Rockstar, and while so much is still uncertain, we are forced to make this incredibly difficult decision for the well-being of our community. Rockstar Cheerleading and Dance in Greenville will close its doors indefinitely. Although this is painful, we believe it is the best option to help everyone begin the healing process. While we embark on our own journeys to process what has been alleged, some may have a longer and more difficult road. We must do all we can to help them. If you find yourself or someone else struggling in crisis, please seek help immediately." And then they link to resources. On September 15th, an amended lawsuit by Strom Law Firm was filed. This one is 76 pages long, and it names more defendants. So this is the one that I'm going to go through. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I've highlighted what I think is most relevant. You can go through it on your own. I'll link to that document as well. It is filed in the United States District Court for the District of South Carolina in the Greenville Division. It is filed on behalf of Jane Doe, Jane Doe 1, Jane Doe 2, Jane Doe 3, Jane Doe 4, Jane Doe 5, Jane Doe 6, Jane Doe 7, John Doe 1, John Doe 2, and John and Jane Does 1 through 100 versus Varsity Brands LLC, Varsity Spirit LLC, Varsity Brands Holding Company Inc., U.S. All-Star Federation, USA Federation of Sport Cheerleading, DBA USA Cheer, Jeff Webb, Charles Bank Capital Partners LP, Bain Capital LP, Rockstar Cheer and Dance Incorporated, Catherine Ann Foster as the personal representative of the estate of Scott Foster, Kathy Foster individually, Kenny Feely, Josh Guyton, Nathan Allen Plank, Christopher Hinton, Tracy, aka or formerly known as Trayvon Black, Peter Hawley, and other unknown defendants. And guys, like I said, I'm just going to summarize. I will paraphrase some things that contain explicit language. I have found the parts that I feel to be are most relevant that don't. A lot of it is a lot of legal jargon and supporting laws that support their case, and some of it is a little bit repetitive. For over 20 years, Scott Foster operated, managed, and coached young cheerleaders from across the United States. On August 22nd, 2022, Scott Foster died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound near his home in Greenville, South Carolina. At the time of his death, Foster, along with his wife Kathy Foster, were the owners of a preeminent cheerleading gym and coaching empire in the upstate of South Carolina. Upon information and belief, Mr. Foster had recently learned of a criminal investigation against him in his capacity as the owner, manager, and coach of Rockstar Greenville. Foster's death opened a deluge of allegations against not only Scott Foster, but also against his wife, Kathy Foster, their gym, Rockstar Greenville, together the Rockstar Greenville defendants, and the other Rockstar affiliated gyms, as well as Varsity Spirit LLC, its affiliated company, and other Rockstar affiliated gyms, as well as Varsity Spirit LLC, its affiliated companies, their parent company, Bain Capital LP, and their governing bodies, the USASF and USA Cheer. And we're going to get into a little bit of a history lesson about how all those companies work together in a little bit further down in this lawsuit. Defendants established a competitive environment soliciting young athletes to cross state lines with minimal parental or adult supervision to converge at pre-scheduled locations where these athletes were then exposed to drugs, alcohol, and predatory conduct by adults, including coaches and choreographers, all while publicly representing that defendants publicly purported to provide a culture of safety in the sport. Upon information and belief, the Rockstar Greenville defendants, along with other gyms and coaches, were empowered and placed in positions of trust and authority by the varsity defendants, all while the varsity defendants knew or should have known that these same coaches and gyms were pervasively abusing their athletes. Upon information and belief, the scheme to anoint specific coaches and disregard safety protocols was part of an elaborate plan by the varsity defendants to create a pipeline of young athletes, each of whom represented a significant stream of revenue for the varsity defendants worth billions of dollars. As set forth in this complaint, the defendants together and individually have created, organized, and propagated a system of young athlete abuse against innocent victims, including the John and Jane Doe plaintiffs. This is a complaint for legal and equitable relief for the victims of this scheme. And then it lists all of the defendants. So I think we're pretty familiar with Varsity Brands and its companies, and we'll get into a little bit of that more in detail. This lists the various coaches and their roles. So Kenny Feely was a coach and it was employed with Carolina All-Stars. He is also the founder and owner of Spring CDT. Josh Guyton was a coach and protege of defendant Scott Foster. Christopher Hinton was a coach. Nathan Allen Plank was also a coach at Rockstar. And Tracy or Trayvon Black was a coach also at Rockstar. Peter Hawley was a coach at Rockstar. And then Jeff Webb is named as a defendant specifically. He is actually the founder of Varsity Brands. He created, owned, and operated and controlled Varsity Brands, Varsity Spirit, Varsity Brands Holding Company, USASF, USA Cheer, all of which did business throughout the United States, including in Greenville County. And it goes on to explain all of these entities and their role in the cheer industry. It goes on to give background on the different camps that Varsity runs. It's very detailed in sort of how the cheer industry works. It goes on to say the Varsity defendants have been one of the largest purveyors of these competitions and camps and the various expenses required to participate in them, controlling an estimated 80 to 90% of the market. And this is where it gets into a little bit of history of all-star cheerleading, which I found to be very interesting. In 2003, a group of all-star cheerleading coaches formed an independent 501c3 organization called the National All-Star Cheerleading Coaches Congress, or the NACCC, to establish uniform rules for all-star cheerleading. The group, which would promote both varsity and non-varsity events, met in Atlanta and created the first set of universal all-star cheerleading rules. Within 1 week, emphasis mine, within 1 week, defendant Jeff Webb, through Varsity, founded the USASF and mandated that all-star athletes purchase a USASF membership as a requirement to competing at varsity-sponsored events. The NACCC found itself unable to compete with Varsity based on this requirement. Jeff Webb proposed a merger, which informally took place in his boardroom at Varsity headquarters in Memphis without the board of directors present. Reportedly, as an olive branch, the NACCC would become the Rules Committee of the USASF in perpetuity. However, despite this agreement, just a few years after the merger, the NACCC arm of the USASF was dissolved by Varsity, with all rulemaking for All-Star Cheer becoming vested in USASF. At the same time, as of 2006, Varsity promoted certain all-star member gyms as being USASF certified, a seal that in the industry was purportedly synonymous with a warrant that the gym, its coaches, and its choreographers were deemed safe, and that the gym followed best practices related to athlete safety. At all times relevant to this complaint, the Varsity defendants and their co-conspirators used these private all-star gyms like defendant Rockstar to gain access to paying athletes and their families, marketing that membership in a USASF certified gym will provide the athlete with access to the highest echelon competitions in the sport and under strict safety standards. Meanwhile, membership in USASF and with a varsity affiliated gym mandates competing in a specified number of annual varsity events. Okay, and then it goes on to explain the state of play system, the cash only aspect at the door. All of this is being mentioned in this lawsuit. Then it goes into more of a history lesson around all-star cheerleading, which is important to know, I think, this background as we move forward in the industry and with this case. In 1971, Jeff Webb began his work in cheerleading as an employee at the National Cheerleaders Association, NCA, where he created to operate cheer camps, working for Lawrence Herkimer, known as the original pioneer of cheer. In 1974, Jeff Webb left Herkimer and NCA and formed his own group, which he similarly named the Universal Cheerleaders Association, or UCA. So thus was born NCA and UCA. As with Herkimer's Association, NCA, Varsity began as a provider of cheer camps. The company would quickly expand into apparel, organizing competitions, and operating sanctioning boards in addition to the camps. Jeff Webb exercised control over all aspects of All-Star Cheer, including rulemaking. He was at the forefront of the conception and execution of the alleged unlawful conspiracy as set forth here in this lawsuit. At all times relevant to this complaint, under the direction and control of Jeff Webb, the varsity defendants, USASF and USA Cheer, have relied upon access to child athletes who compete at varsity competitions and who further purchase varsity products, uniforms, and merchandise. Varsity created USASF through a $1 million interest-free loan. The 2004 nonprofit charter certificate lists USASF's address to be Varsity's address. At its inception, USASF was purportedly established to be the sanctioning body that would regulate all-star cheer by setting guidelines, policies, procedures, and processes to ensure an environment that was safe for young athletes in the private gym sector. Jeff Webb would tell a blog years later that his best marketing advice was to differentiate your products from your competitors and develop a strong and trusting relationship with your customers. The best branding results usually come from building and sustaining a culture that people trust. It is also about consistency and authenticity. In 2007, Jeff Webb and Varsity formed USA Cheer, which was also established to provide guidelines, policies, procedures, and processes to ensure an environment safe for young athletes throughout the cheer industry, including all-star cheer. In 2010, in Cheer and Coach Advisor magazine, for which Jeff Webb served on the editorial advisory board and which, upon information and belief, was owned by Varsity, USASF was officially quoted as saying, "Through credentialing, coaches are made aware of expectations as teachers and role models. It is the goal of the USASF to infuse good decisions into each and every credentialed coach so that they may expand the positive life experience of all-star cheerleading and dance into the lives of the youth they encourage. USASF is recognized as the baseline of education for each individual coach and also expect these standards to be met." USA Cheer was also created with an interest-free loan from Varsity. The Director of Education and Programs, Jim Lord, has listed USA Cheer's address to be the same as Varsity's. As part of this responsibility, USASF and USA Cheer were responsible for enforcing guidelines, policies, procedures, and processes. Varsity, through USASF and USA Cheer, can and does enforce bans of athletes, coaches, and teams in its competition for minor rule infractions like the size of hair bows and the use of glitter. Varsity's founder, Jeff Webb, has publicly stated that teams performing at varsity competitions who wore a full uniform and accessories branded by Varsity received higher scores. Yeesh. Upon information and belief, this structure meant that the varsity defendants were entirely self-regulated and were not answerable to any independent entity. Varsity controlled USASF from inception. Varsity submitted the original trademark application for the marks of US All-Star Federation and USASF. Varsity Spirit was listed as the owner. For at least the first 15 years of its existence and upon information and belief, defendants' USASF offices were located at Varsity's corporate address. A Varsity representative answered the phone for USASF. USASF employees were paid directly by Varsity, and Varsity cashed checks issued to the USASF. Varsity also controlled the board of directors for USASF. The USASF board is empowered to set policy for USASF. The board is composed of 13 voting members, 1 seat each for 7 cheer competition producers that started the USASF. The USASF chairman, a senior USASF staff member, and 4 program owner members, including the chairman of the National All-Stars Connection. 2 USASF board seats are permanent and are held by representatives named by the chairman of the USASF. As Varsity has acquired more and more of the USASF's founding event producers, it has continued to expand its control of the USASF board. Presently, the Varsity defendants have control of 75% of the seats of the board of directors. The seats that Varsity does not control do not have voting rights. So Varsity controls most of the board of the USASF, and the seats that they do not control do not have voting rights. In 2007, Varsity founded USA Cheer. As with defendant USASF, USA Cheer listed Varsity's Tennessee headquarters as its own headquarters, and USA Cheer's board included 6 Varsity employees. Under USA Cheer's bylaws, its 13-member board must include members from the following 7 organizations: the Universal Cheerleaders Association, Cheersport, National Cheerleaders Association, United Spirit Association, American Cheerleaders Association, Universal Dance Association, and Jam Fest. Those are all varsity events. John Patterson, a former staffer for the nonprofit Risk Management Center who consulted on youth sports safety, said he has never heard of an arrangement quite like the one between varsity and these nonprofit governing bodies. He said varsity's control of USASF meant whatever varsity wants, varsity can get in terms of rules and regulations of the cheer world. From 2014 to 2018, defendant Charles Bank wholly owned Varsity and or USA Cheer and USASF and provided capital or money to the varsity defendants and USA Cheer and USASF for the purpose of building the network of varsity affiliated private gyms and coaches throughout the United States. In 2018, Bain Capital purchased Varsity from Charles Bank for roughly $2.5 billion with a B, dollars. At the time of the sale, Charles Bank made a new investment in Varsity alongside Bain Capital and retained a minority stake in the business. So that's why they're named as a defendant. This plays into the antitrust suit that is also going on against Varsity. We're not going to talk about that today, but I think this background information is going to be important. They really are trying to establish a case that it was really more about money and what Varsity could profit from than athlete safety, in my opinion. Again, not an attorney. They do go into Jerry Harris and the cases and accusations against him in 2020. And then it starts to get into the accusations against various coaches. In August 2022, varsity affiliated coach Scott Foster ended his life, paraphrasing, amidst an ongoing investigation into allegations that he engaged in misconduct with his minor athletes. Foster had previously been suspended by the USASF when video evidence came to light showing Foster drinking with his underage athletes. Despite his suspension, Foster was nevertheless openly allowed to continue coaching at his Greenville gym and elsewhere and was never barred from attending any varsity-sponsored event. Varsity, in conjunction with USASF and USA Cheer, have hosted multiple competitive events throughout the United States, during which time affiliated teams from across the country converge at a pre-selected location and using hotels, premises, and business hand-selected by Varsity. Upon information and belief, during these events, underage student athletes would commingle with other teams, including their coaches and choreographers, either without chaperones or minimally chaperoned, and would be exposed to environments where drugs and alcohol were readily available and where the student athletes were subject to rampant solicitation and inappropriate sexual conduct and innuendos, including by coaches such as Jerry Harris, Eric Christensen, and Scott Foster. At the same time, individual gyms and coaches would receive substantial benefits from affiliation with Varsity, including the reputational benefits of being affiliated with USASF, USA Cheer, and Varsity brands, and monetary benefits directly linked to the number of competitions in which a gym participated, as well as the number of athletes the gym brought to the competition. In this way, Varsity and the gyms and coaches had a symbiotic relationship where the gyms and coaches supplied the Varsity defendants with hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue from underage athletes, and the coaches and gyms used Varsity's reputation in order to bolster their own reputation with student athletes. It goes on to say it was contrary to Varsity's business model to ban coaches and gyms from their system, as every coach and gym represented a pipeline of current and future revenue. Rather, when allegations about a specific coach or varsity affiliate were made, Varsity, USASF, and USA Cheer either ignored the allegations, determined the allegations were not credible based on arbitrary criteria, or allowed the would-be abuser to quietly exit the varsity affiliated program, with the result that the accused could relocate to a new gym or facility without parents knowing about the allegations of misconduct against minors. For instance, Peter Hawley, one of John Doe II's assailants, was allowed to leave from Rockstar Greenville and relocate to a gym in the Columbia, South Carolina area, where Hawley is still in regular contact with minor athletes. As an additional example, Kenny Feely, who abused and Ray plaintiff Jane Doe III, moved away from his coaching role as Scott Foster's protege and has since launched his own cheering empire, which, upon information and belief, supplies Varsity with a significant revenue stream by way of athletes, competition fees, uniforms, merchandise, and other fees. It goes on to say that Bain Capital and all of Varsity's affiliates should have known if they didn't know already. It goes on to talk about how employees of Varsity resigned their positions because of the abuse and systemic failures they saw within the system. They are really building a case here against Varsity. Now on to Scott Foster and the allegations made against him. Scott Foster was a cheerleader at the University of Louisville and began coaching young cheerleaders in Kentucky in 1996. The University of Louisville is a preeminent name in the world of competitive cheerleading. Athletes who come out of the Louisville program have a huge name recognition in industry, following them easily to recruit other young athletes. In fact, gym owners who are also alumni of the University of Louisville program have the ability to recruit athletes from across the country, regardless of where their gym is located. Athletes regularly travel or move to be close to a premier gym and coach, going so far as to enroll in homeschool to provide additional hours for training. Scott Foster moved to Greenville, South Carolina in 1999 and shortly thereafter began operating an all-star cheer gym along with his wife, defendant Kathy Foster. Scott Foster and Kathy Foster created World Spirit Federation, or WSF, for competition cheering before ultimately selling WSF to Varsity Brands in 2006. In 2007, Scott Foster and Kathy Foster started Rockstar Cheer and Dance, a gym to coach competition cheer. Rockstar's mission was to provide a structured environment of competitive cheerleading while accomplishing our goals, to teach dedication, commitment, self-confidence, teamwork, discipline, responsibility, and leadership in a family-friendly, safe, and fun environment. Rockstar's Cheer Gym was certified by USASF as meeting all-star standards with respect to coaching credentials, program quality, and athlete safety. As such, at all times relevant to this complaint, Varsity warranted to athletes and families that Rockstar Greenville and its coaches could be trusted based on standards established by Varsity and USASF and recognized through the Varsity and USASF competition cheer world. One of Rockstar's teams, Beatles, was known as one of the best teams in the country, and Scott and Kathy Foster were able to recruit athletes nationwide on Beatles' success. In 2018, Beatles won Varsity's coveted World Championship title. This further elevated Rockstar's status and became the team of one of the most lucrative to the Varsity defendants. At all times relevant to this complaint, Rockstar remained in lockstep with Varsity, competing at Varsity's events, purchasing Varsity's merchandise, participating in the Varsity University training conferences, and by virtue of competing in Varsity events, mandating that Rockstar athletes become members of USASF, including paying USASF annual dues. Again, it talks about recruiting of young athletes and how the model allowed Scott Foster and programs like Rockstar Cheer to do so. Varsity, USA, and then it goes on to say that Varsity, USASF, USA Cheer, and by virtue of their acquisition, ownership, and control, Bain Capital, were made aware of serious and disturbing allegations related to many of the Varsity coaches, including Scott Foster. For instance, in 2017, video footage emerged of Scott Foster drinking alcohol with his underage athletes. In addition, during the same time frame, Scott Foster was also paying for an apartment for his athletes where some of them would live and where minor athletes would gather to do drugs and drink alcohol with and without Scott and Kathy Foster. Scott Foster also used his position of power within the Varsity network to message underage athletes and to arrange meetups with these athletes at the Varsity competitions. During at least two of these competitions, Scott Foster engaged in illicit sexual acts with underage athletes who were not old enough to provide consent. Scott Foster's conduct was not isolated nor unknown to Varsity, USASF, USA Cheer, or Bain Capital. Jeff Webb is currently chairman of the board of directors of Varsity Brands LLC. He was previously Varsity's president, but resigned in 2020 amid the Jerry Harris sex abuse scandal. During the time frame of this complaint, USASF received numerous reports and allegations related to defendant Scott Foster, as well as other coaches, choreographers, videographers, and music directors. Upon information and belief, the general response from USASF was to disregard these reports and accusations as attempts by disgruntled athletes and parents to get coaches and gyms in trouble if the athletes did not receive coveted team positions. And then it goes on to talk about the USA Today's investigations and people named in those investigations. Upon information and belief, USASF has received hundreds of complaints against coaches, choreographers, videographers, and others accused of sexual misconduct. Until recently, however, USASF failed to dedicate full-time staff to managing investigation of these complaints. USASF has been excruciatingly slow to develop policies and procedures for keeping athletes safe from sexual abuse in an industry rife with it. According to its own website, USASF is the U.S. All-Star Federation. It's about safety standards. It's about coaches' education. It's about providing a safe environment to allow for the continued growth of all-star cheerleading and dance across the country. It's about parents knowing their children are being taught using safe methods that are in accordance with the standard of care. It's about standardization of rules from one competition to the next. It's about time. In the years following this public representation, however, USASF gym and coaching training has focused almost exclusively on avoiding physical injury to the athletes. In fact, USASF athletic performance standards dealt only with things like hair accessories, makeup, uniform, choreography, and music. It goes on to talk about USASF's policies, which you can find, the certifications that they provided to gyms, etc. It also alleges flaws in USASF's systems in investigating these claims. The next big section of the lawsuit really is trying to establish, from what I can tell, is trying to establish a web of conspiracy between Varsity, its parent companies, USASF, in trying to cover up or save face so that they can continue to make profits. And then here is where we get into the section of describing the abuse alleged against Scott Foster. And this gets pretty graphic. Plaintiff John Doe 1 began to cheer in 6th grade for his all-star cheer team in California. In addition to his gym fees beginning in his 6th grade year, John Doe 1 was also responsible for paying an annual competition fee to Varsity as well as an annual NSASF fee. During his 2017 to 2018 season, John Doe 1 moved to Las Vegas, where he joined a Level 4 Blackjacks team. During the season, John Doe 1, his team won a number of competition. During this same time frame, John Doe 1 was aware of Scott Foster through Foster's reputation in the defendant Varsity community. Specifically, Varsity promoted Foster and his gym on social media, encouraging young athletes to seek out Foster and to aspire to be like Foster. John Doe 1 followed Scott Foster on social media. At the time, John Doe 1 was 15 years old, going on 16. Scott Foster followed plaintiff John Doe 1 back and began to directly message John Doe 1. John Doe 1 and Scott Foster exchanged messages for about 1 month before Varsity's NCAA tournament. Sometime prior to the tournament, defendant Scott Foster asked John Doe 1 for his phone number and thereafter began to message John Doe 1 about meeting up at NCAA. From the tone and tenor of the communications, John Doe 1 understood that Scott Foster was asking for John Doe 1 to engage in explicit acts. John Doe 1 felt uncomfortable with the exchange, but also felt uncomfortable ceasing communications with such an important figure in the competitive cheer community. As the NCAA tournament approached, Scott Foster asked John Doe 1 to send photographs of various parts of plaintiff's body, including plaintiff's genitalia. Scott Foster also sent John Doe 1 pictures of defendant's body, including his private part. During NCAA in 2019, Scott Foster and plaintiff John Doe 1 had their first encounter. In May of 19, when John Doe 1 was 16 years old and attending Varsity's Summit competition in Florida, Scott Foster once again solicited from John Doe 1. When John Doe 1 traveled to Summit, he did not feel he could say no to Scott Foster. and it goes on to explicitly describe these incidents. Following these incidents, John Doe continued to attend varsity events during which drugs and alcohol have always been readily available. In or around 2019, an incident came to light involving Jerry Harris, a former coach of a varsity-affiliated gym where Harris, a coach, was accused of soliciting sex from two 14-year-old cheerleaders. Following this incident, varsity required any member of USASF over the age of 18 to submit to a varsity-sanctioned background check and watch a 30-minute video on safety during competitions. Yet no other policies, processes, or procedures changed. The competitions remained expositions putting together minor children with adult coaches in unchaperoned environments with copious access to drugs and alcohol. John Doe, too, began cheering in around 2013 when he was in 8th grade. In 2014, John Doe 2 moved to Greenville, where he joined Rockstar. Almost immediately after John Doe 2 began to cheer for Rockstar, two coaches, Trey Black, and Peter Hawley, began making inappropriate and vulgar comments to him. When John Doe 2 was 16, the conduct escalated to the point where defendants Black and Hawley, who were at all times under Scott Foster's control, pressured John Doe 2 to send nude photographs. Eventually, John Doe 2 relented and sent the photos. In addition, John Doe 2 received nude photographs from one of the coaches. After this, Rockstar's coaches also began to pressure John Doe 2 to come to the Rockstar house, which was a house paid for by defendants Scott and Kathy Foster. At all times relevant to this complaint and to the extent of John Doe 2 knowledge, the Rockstar athletes and coaches, including Scott and Kathy Foster, used the Rockstar house to host parties, do drugs, and drink alcohol with the minor athletes. On one occasion, when John Doe 2 went to Rockstar House at the request of the coach tried to engage in explicit with John Doe 2 and forced John Doe 2 to watch explicit videos. John Doe 2 was just 16 at the time. In addition to the encounter at the Rockstar house and receiving nude photographs from one of defendant Scott Foster's coaches, another Rockstar coach who was at least twice John Doe 2's age would often invite John Doe 2 over and offer marijuana and alcohol. John Doe 2 is informed and believes that defendants Scott Foster and Kathy Foster knew and condoned this behavior, and that this behavior was actually encouraged as a way of ensuring that the athletes remained at Rockstar. John Doe 2's story goes on. Now we're into Jane Doe 1. Jane Doe 1 was on defendant Scott Foster's team, and he immediately began grooming her. Scott Foster would sit with Jane Doe in his gym for hours talking to her about other athletes' sex lives. Scott Foster also asked Jane Doe 1 whether she had ever had any interest in engaging in certain sexual activity, including explicit. These sexual discussions made Jane Doe 1 extremely uncomfortable, but at the same time created an artificial sense of closeness with Scott Foster. When Jane Doe was 17, Scott Foster told Jane Doe 1 that he wanted to use his connections to facilitate her recruitment by the University of Louisville. Before a varsity competition, Jane Doe 1 traveled to University of Louisville a day early with Scott and Kathy Foster. Scott Foster, Kathy Foster, and Jane Doe 1 arrived at the hotel a day earlier than the rest of the team. When Jane Doe 1 realized she forgot to pack a toothbrush, she called Scott Foster, who brought a toothbrush to her room. He then entered her room and proceeded to sit on her bed and come on to Jane Doe 1. Jane Doe 2. In 2019, Jane Doe 2 moved to North Carolina and began to commute to train at Rockstar Greenville. During one of her earliest practices, Jane Doe 2 trained with Scott Foster, who complimented her on her looks and began almost immediately to touch her inappropriately. In the months that followed, Scott Foster, with Kathy Foster's knowledge, began to invite Jane Doe 2 to his house. Ultimately, Jane Doe 2 spent the night twice. Each time, Scott Foster gave Jane Doe 2, a minor, drugs and alcohol. Jane Doe 2 was provided alcohol and drugs on numerous occasions while she cheered with Rockstar, including during competitions hosted by Varsity and overseen by USASF. During one NCAA competition, Jane Doe 2 recalls going to a party with other athletes at the penthouse of one of the Varsity selected hotels. At the party, Jane Doe 2 drank alcohol with Scott Foster and the other athletes, of whom were underage. While Jane Doe 2 was cheering at Rockstar, Scott Foster and his other coaches commonly gave underage athletes drugs and alcohol. This created an environment where athletes' inhibitions were down and also created a sense of sexual availability between the adult coaches and the child athletes. In Jane Doe 2's experience, the attitude from Varsity has been to ignore or discount victims who come forward. All of these Jane and John Does have similar stories where they were given drugs and alcohol as minors, where they were inappropriately touched, inappropriately messaged. There is even an incident in here where one of the victims was believed to have been given a date rape drug and has very little or no memory from an evening spent in a nightclub with Scott Foster. These other coaches are named with similar stories. Plaintiff Jane Doe 7 was asked to send explicit photos of herself, but consistently refused. And so the coach, Nathan Plank, sent videos of himself doing inappropriate things. All of these coaches were seen as authority figures, and many of these victims were afraid to report. Plaintiff Jane Doe 7 saw the coach as an authority figure in the gym, a coach, and a person with large social media presence and following. Jane Doe 7 feared that upsetting the coach may lead to being targeted by other coaches or blackballed by the gym. Jane Doe 7's mother reported the abuse of Jane Doe 7 to the Greenville County Sheriff's Department and USASF and Varsity. Jane Doe 7's mother's complaints were dismissed as an attempt to manipulate her daughter's position on the cheer team and in the gym. Jane Doe 7's mother was told that if she did not like what she was seeing or experiencing at Rockstar, then she could find another gym. And y'all, as it is so important that these victim stories are heard, for the sake of the graphic nature. I am not going to read all of them, but again, you can find them for yourself in this lawsuit, which I will link. So, after all that, this is heartbreaking. This is disgusting. This is scary, right? Like it's awful, it's unimaginable, and what a nightmare. And I I just want to say to the victims and their families, I'm sorry that this happened. I'm sorry that this happened in the context of a sport that you loved, in a place that was supposed to be safe, where you were supposed to be protected. And I want to say thank you for bringing light where there has been much darkness. It doesn't feel like it, I'm sure. I'm sure that it feels scary and unknown, and I cannot even imagine what you are feeling right now and what you're going through, but thank you, because without your voice, darkness could have continued to prevail. So now what do we do? What do we do? What are we supposed to do, right? As parents, as people who've been involved in the sport, what do we do? It feels overwhelming and maddening, and I've gone through all of those emotions of anger and why and grief and more anger and rage. But what can we do? I think that having light shed on these stories is going to cause a lot of people to ask a lot of questions. And I don't think that this sport will ever be the same. Do I think that all-star cheerleading will cease to exist? I don't. But I don't think that it will ever be the same. It will never be the same. And I think that's a good thing. Absolutely. It can never be the same. We cannot continue like this. There are going to have to be some people in some powerful positions that are going to need to look inward and ask themselves some serious questions. And I am sure, and this is speculative, I don't know, but I'm sure that their lawyers will come out with their version of the story. But regardless of where these lawsuits end up, cheerleading must never be the same. There has to be change. So, what can we do as parents moving forward? What can we do as parents moving forward? Because All Star Cheerleading is a private club sport and it is owned by privately owned businesses. I I wonder if there is only so much sanctioning that can be done. There needs to be a lot more that can be done, and a lot more needs to be taken seriously. Absolutely. But ultimately, it's up to these private businesses to take a look at their hiring practices. We must go back to our privately owned gyms and ask questions. And if your owners are not willing to have those conversations with you, may I warn you that that is a red flag. I have been involved in only two organizations as an all-star cheer mom, but both of them, the owners were always willing to take a meeting or a phone call with me if I asked. They were always the first to communicate with parents when there was something to be discussed. They were always transparent and readily available. And that is the first thing that you need to look for in working with these privately owned businesses. Are the owners transparent and willing to communicate with you and answer your questions? We must choose the all-star gym that works best for our family, that aligns with our family's values. So sit down with your family and determine what are your values as an all-star cheer family. And then make sure that the gym that you are either a part of or want to be a part of aligns with those values. We need to look for things like transparency in their hiring processes, how they communicate, equip, and train their coaches. For example, I was part of a gym that they were doing background checks on their coaches and employees long before it was required. The most recent gym that I was a part of actually has hired a team of lawyers that has formed a firm called Sports Compliance. And Sports Compliance looks into every ins and outs of not only USASF but multiple requirements from multiple sports, and helped the gym to go above and beyond to maintain athlete safety. So look for things from your gym. Look for things that your owners are communicating that they will be doing, because whether they're involved or not, this affects everybody in the all-star community. And now more than ever, owners need to be looking at ways that they can keep their athletes safe above and beyond what entities are asking of them. Look at your gym policies. For example, our coaches have never had contact with our athletes during a competition other than when they are in the practice area or performing. They even went as far as the coaches don't even stay at the same hotel as the athletes. Most of the time, I think there was only one time where I actually even knew where the coaches were staying. Long ago, our coaches would not follow the athletes on Snapchat. And even now, in order for athletes to be connected with coaches on social media, the coaches needed to have a separate public facing account that was completely transparent. Our coaches do not text our athletes under 18 without a parent on the group chat. These are simple things that you can be looking for to make sure that your gym and your coaches are keeping your athlete's best interest in mind. There has never been an instance where my coach has been alone with my daughter. Even in a private lesson setting, there are cameras, there are other coaches present. And one thing that I really appreciated about our gym was the team reps were with the coaches and the team from start of competition to finish. We went through background checks. We went through all of the training and were certified as well so that we could be credentialed to go backstage and on the warm-up mat with the athletes. I think that might be a prevalent policy that gyms could implement and that they will implement, is having those parent representatives with the team at all times from start to finish of the competition. Hopefully, moving forward, we will have more answers. We will find healing. We will find ways that will make our sport safer. I pray that that happens. God, let there not be any more victims. Thank you for sticking with me through this. I know this is hard. Ask those questions. Find community to process with. I'm available. You can email me, hi@thecheermomblog.com, if you just need to process your thoughts. I'm here. Let's process together. We will get through this. I pray that cheer will continue to be a sport where so many athletes can have a place to be themselves and find friendship and strength. Let's be that change to help make that happen. I'll see you guys next week. Love you.